There are deaths that shake the world. Moments in history where the demise of a single individual sends tremors across continents. And then there is the end of Benito Mussolini, the infamous fascist dictator of Italy. A conclusion so savage, so utterly debased, that it transcends imagination and stands alone in the grim annals of modern history. From the dizzying zenith of absolute power, where his voice boomed from Roman balconies and made all of Europe hold its breath, this self-styled Caesar was plunged into the deepest abyss of humiliation. How did the man who promised to restore the glory of an empire become a hunted fugitive, disguised in a German soldier's coat? How did the all-powerful Il Duce, the leader, meet his end not in a blaze of glory, but in a dusty village lane, executed like a common criminal? And how did his lifeless body come to be strung up by its heels from the iron girder of a gas station, desecrated by a vengeful mob in a public square? This is not merely the story of a dictator's death. It is the story of a promise turned to poison, of a nation's adoration curdled into pure hatred, and of a reckoning so visceral it remains shocking to this day. To understand the horror of his end, we must first understand the man, the myth, and the 20 years of darkness he cast over Italy. Join us as we uncover the chilling, full-throated truth of the downfall of Benito Mussolini, a secret history that many have never truly known. The man who would become Italy's iron-fisted ruler, Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini, began his life not in a palace, but in the humble, dusty confines of Predappio, a small town in the Romagna region of northern Italy. Born on July 29, 1883, he was a child forged in the crucible of contradiction. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a man of fire and iron, a blacksmith by trade, but a revolutionary socialist by conviction. The clang of his hammer against the anvil was a constant soundtrack to Benito's youth, a rhythmic counterpoint to the fervent political discussions that filled their modest home. Alessandro was an ardent follower of Karl Marx and other revolutionary figures, a man who saw the world through the lens of class struggle and yearned for the overthrow of the established order. He named his firstborn son Benito after the Mexican revolutionary Benito Juárez, a clear declaration of his political faith. In stark contrast, his mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a devout Catholic schoolteacher, a woman of discipline, piety, and order. Where Alessandro preached rebellion, Rosa taught reverence. Where his father saw a world to be torn down and rebuilt, his mother saw a soul to be saved through faith and strict moral conduct. These two opposing forces, the fiery anti-clerical socialism of his father and the rigid, structured piety of his mother, warred within the young Mussolini, shaping a personality that was at once rebellious and authoritarian, chaotic and obsessed with discipline. From his earliest years, Benito was a difficult child. He was restless, arrogant, and possessed of volcanic temper. He was known for his belligerence, his quickness to start a fight, and his utter refusal to be subjugated by any authority. He was a bully on the playground, but one who also possessed a sharp, undeniable intelligence. This unruly boy, often found brawling in the village streets, was also a voracious reader who demonstrated a prodigious talent for language, both in writing and in speech. Recognizing his intellect but despairing of his behavior, his parents sent him to a strict Catholic boarding school run by Salesian monks. They hoped the rigid environment would temper his violent nature. It had the opposite effect. Mussolini chafed under the strict rules, viewing them as an intolerable assault on his freedom. The environment only sharpened his rebellious instincts. The experiment ended in disaster when, in a fit of rage, he attacked a fellow student with a penknife and was promptly expelled. This act of violence was a dark premonition of the man he would become. As a young man, Mussolini channeled his restless energy into journalism and socialist activism. He embraced his father's politics with fervor, becoming a charismatic and effective propagandist for the left. He wrote for numerous socialist newspapers, his articles fiery and eloquent, championing workers' rights and railing against the monarchy, the bourgeoisie, and the church. In 1909, he moved to the city of Trento, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to become the editor of L'Avvenire del Lavoratore, The Worker's Future. His inflammatory anti-government writings quickly landed him in trouble with the Austrian authorities, who arrested him and expelled him from the region. By 1912, Mussolini had returned to Italy and risen to become one of the most prominent figures in the Italian Socialist Party. As editor of its official newspaper, Avanti, Forward, his powerful prose and spellbinding oratory skills gave him a national platform. He was a master of rhetoric, calling for strikes and protests and vehemently opposing the looming threat of a great European war. But the outbreak of World War I in 1914 would prove to be the great turning point of his life. Initially, he towed the party line, advocating for Italy's strict neutrality. However, as the war raged on, Mussolini underwent a profound ideological transformation. He began to see the war not as a capitalist plot, but as a revolutionary opportunity, a crucible that could forge a new, stronger, and more powerful Italy. He became convinced that participation in the conflict could win Italy new territories, terre irredente, unredeemed lands, and galvanize the national spirit. This dramatic shift was a betrayal of everything the Socialist Party stood for. His newfound nationalism was seen as heresy. In late 1914, he was summoned before the party leadership and, after a stormy session, was unceremoniously expelled. "You have expelled me," he reportedly snarled at them, "but you have not killed me. You will see me again." Now an outcast, Mussolini was a man reborn. Shedding his socialist skin, he embraced a fervent, aggressive nationalism. With funding from industrialists, who also wanted Italy to enter the war, he founded his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy. Its masthead declared it a socialist daily, but its content was anything but. It became a mouthpiece for militarism, interventionism, and a rabid patriotism. When Italy finally joined the war on the side of the Allies in 1915, Mussolini eagerly enlisted in the army. He served on the front lines as a corporal until 1917, when he was seriously wounded by the accidental explosion of a mortar shell which embedded dozens of metal fragments in his body. His war was over. He returned to a country in turmoil. The war had been a brutal, costly affair for Italy. The returning soldiers, who had been promised land and glory, came home to a nation on the brink of collapse. The economy was shattered, inflation was rampant, unemployment soared, and the government seemed paralyzed and incompetent. A deep sense of national humiliation, the feeling of a mutilated victory, after being shortchanged at the post-war peace treaties, festered across the land. The political landscape was polarized, with communist and socialist movements gaining strength, leading to a period of intense social conflict known as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, marked by strikes, factory occupations, and political violence. In this cauldron of chaos, dissatisfaction, and fear, Mussolini saw his chance. He recognized the deep hunger for a strong leader who could restore order, crush the communist threat, and reclaim Italy's honor. The people, desperate for a savior, began to listen. By 1921, Mussolini had formalized his movement into the National Fascist Party, Partito Nazionale Fascista. His message of order,
Discipline and national revival resonated powerfully with a growing segment of the population. The middle class, terrified of losing their property in a communist takeover, flocked to his banner. Business leaders and industrialists, weary of constant strikes, saw him as a man who could tame the unions. Even elements within the military and the police, who admired his patriotism and tough stance, began to offer their tacit support. By the autumn of 1922, Italy was teetering on the edge of civil war. The liberal government was weak and fractured, unable to control the escalating violence. Strikes and riots paralyzed the nation. Seizing this moment of supreme crisis, Mussolini decided to make his ultimate move, a brazen gamble for power. He announced a march on Rome, threatening to have tens of thousands of his black shirts converge on the capital and take control of the government by force if it was not handed over to him. On October 28, 1922, the march began. Fascist squads occupied government buildings and telephone exchanges across northern and central Italy. In truth, the march itself was more theater than threat. The black shirts were poorly armed and could have been easily dispersed by the regular army. The government initially planned to declare a state of siege, but in a fateful decision, King Victor Emmanuel III refused to sign the order. The king was a timid and indecisive man. He feared that ordering the army to fire on the fascists would trigger a full-blown civil war. He was also advised by conservative politicians and military leaders that Mussolini could be tamed and used to restore order before being discarded. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Believing he could control the ambitious demagogue, the king invited Mussolini to Rome. On October 29, 1922, Benito Mussolini, arriving not at the head of a conquering army, but by overnight train, was formally appointed Prime Minister of Italy. He was just 39 years old. Once in power, Mussolini wasted no time. Over the next few years, he systematically dismantled Italy's democratic institutions and consolidated his absolute authority. He used intimidation, legal maneuvering, and outright violence. He passed the Ascianbo Law, which guaranteed a two-thirds majority in parliament to whichever party won the most votes, ensuring fascist dominance. In 1924, his thugs kidnapped and murdered Giacomo Matteotti, a courageous socialist leader who had dared to expose fascist electoral fraud. The ensuing public outrage nearly toppled his government, but Mussolini brazenly took responsibility for the violence and dared his opponents to remove him. They faltered, and he emerged stronger than ever. By 1925, he had effectively crushed all opposition. He banned other political parties, abolished free elections, took control of the press, and established a secret police force, the OVRA, to hunt down dissenters. Trade unions were replaced by fascist-controlled corporations. He adopted the title Il Duce, the leader, and cultivated a pervasive cult of personality. His image was everywhere, in posters, in newsreels, in textbooks. He was portrayed as a demigod, a man of boundless energy and infallible wisdom, the savior of the nation. For nearly 2 decades, Mussolini ruled Italy with an iron fist. He presented an image of dynamic modernity and strength to the world. He launched massive public works projects, draining the Pontine marshes to create new farmland, building the first autostrade, highways, and erecting monumental fascist architecture. He famously boasted of making the trains run on time, a potent symbol of the order and efficiency he had supposedly brought to the nation. But behind this glittering facade of propaganda, the reality was grim. The Italian economy remained weak, burdened by inefficient policies and massive state spending on military and prestige projects. The corporate state he created stifled innovation and served primarily to enrich fascist officials. While propagandists celebrated the new fascist man, the average Italian citizen faced high inflation, stagnant wages, and rising unemployment. Yet, thanks to a colossal propaganda machine that controlled every aspect of public life, Mussolini maintained his image as the resolute leader who had saved Italy from chaos and was leading it towards a glorious new destiny. Beneath the surface, however, the seeds of discontent were being sown, silent cracks forming in the foundations of his totalitarian regime, portending the cataclysm to come.
As the 1930s dawned, Mussolini's ambitions expanded beyond Italy's borders. He yearned to resurrect the Roman Empire, to create a new Italian sphere of influence that would dominate the Mediterranean. This imperial dream demanded conquest. In 1935, he set his sights on Ethiopia, then Abyssinia, one of the few remaining independent nations in Africa. The invasion was a brutal and one-sided affair. The Italian army, possessing modern tanks, aircraft, and artillery, crushed the poorly equipped Ethiopian forces. In a shocking display of barbarity, Mussolini's forces used chemical weapons, including mustard gas, which was rained down from planes on soldiers and civilians alike, in clear violation of international law. The League of Nations condemned the aggression and imposed weak economic sanctions, but no nation was willing to take meaningful action to stop him. The conquest of Ethiopia was complete by 1936. This easy victory filled Mussolini with a sense of arrogant invincibility. He believed he could act with impunity on the world stage. It was during this period that his relationship with another rising European dictator began to deepen. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, had long admired Mussolini, viewing him as a trailblazer of fascism. Beginning in 1936, the two men drew closer. They found common ground in their shared hatred of democracy, their militaristic ambitions, and their desire to upend the post-World War I European order. In 1939, this relationship was formalized with the Pact of Steel, a full-fledged military alliance that bound Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany together, creating the core of the Axis powers. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering the Second World War, Mussolini was caught unprepared. Despite his bombastic rhetoric, he knew Italy's military was in no condition for a major, prolonged war. The campaigns in Ethiopia and the Spanish Civil War, where he had supported Franco, had depleted its resources. Italy lacked the industrial capacity, modern equipment, and strategic raw materials for a conflict on this scale. He initially declared Italy a non-belligerent. But as he watched Hitler's army sweep across Western Europe with terrifying speed in the spring of 1940, his opportunism got the better of him. Fearing he would be left out of the spoils of a swift German victory, he made a fateful decision. On June 10, 1940, believing the war was all but over, Mussolini declared war on a reeling France and Great Britain. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt aptly described this move as a stab in the back. Mussolini's gamble proved to be a disaster. His belief in a quick victory was a delusion. The Italian military, plagued by poor leadership, outdated equipment, and low morale, proved spectacularly incompetent. An ill-conceived invasion of Greece turned into a humiliating debacle, forcing the Germans to bail them out. The campaign in North Africa against the British became a series of costly defeats. The Italian contingent sent to fight alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front was decimated. Italy simply did not have the strength to sustain a long war. The nation's resources were stretched to the breaking point, and the spirit of its soldiers was crushed. By 1943, the situation was catastrophic. A string of military defeats had shattered the myth of fascist power. At home, food shortages, Allied bombing raids, and the ever-growing casualty lists had turned the public against the war and its architect. The Italian people, who had once cheered Mussolini as their savior, now cursed him as the author of their ruin. Even his closest allies within the fascist regime, the very men he had raised to power, began to doubt his leadership and secretly plotted his removal. The unshakable power of Il Duce was beginning to crumble. The end was near.
By the summer of 1943, Benito Mussolini's regime was in its death throes. The final blow came on July 9th, when Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The Italian army on the island crumbled with shocking speed, offering little resistance. The direct attack on Italian soil exposed the utter bankruptcy of the fascist war effort and sent a wave of panic through the country's leadership. King Victor Emmanuel III, along with senior military commanders and even prominent members of the Fascist Party, realized that Mussolini had to go if Italy was to be saved from complete destruction. A conspiracy formed within the highest echelon of the regime. On the night of July 24–25, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism, the supreme body of the party which hadn't met in years, was convened in Rome. In a dramatic, tense session that lasted late into the night, Dino Grandi, a senior fascist leader, put forward a motion to strip Mussolini of his command of the armed forces and restore constitutional authority to the king. After hours of debate, the motion passed, 19–7. It was a stunning vote of no confidence. The next afternoon, Mussolini, still seemingly unaware of the full gravity of the situation, went to the royal palace for his regular meeting with the king. There, in a brief, cold exchange, Victor Emmanuel III informed him that he was dismissed as prime minister. "My dear Duce," he said, "it's no longer any good. Italy has gone to bits." Mussolini was stunned. As he exited the palace, he was intercepted by carabinieri officers, bundled into an ambulance, and placed under arrest. The government, fearing a rescue attempt by his loyalists, moved the fallen dictator from one secret location to another. He was eventually taken to the Campo Imperatore Hotel, a remote ski resort high in the Apennine Mountains, a seemingly inescapable prison. With Mussolini gone, the new government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8, 1943, Italy officially signed an armistice, surrendering to the Allied forces. The Italian army was ordered to cease hostilities against the Allies and, in a dramatic reversal, to resist the Germans, who were now considered an occupying force. But Adolf Hitler was not about to let his fellow dictator and ally fall. Enraged by what he saw as Italy's betrayal, he ordered a daring rescue mission. On September 12, 1943, in a spectacular operation known as the Gran Sasso Raid or Operation Oak, a team of German SS commandos led by the legendary Otto Skorzeny landed in gliders on the mountaintop next to the hotel. They overwhelmed the surprised Italian guards without firing a single shot and liberated Mussolini. Hitler flew the rescued Mussolini to Germany and installed him as the leader of a new puppet state in German-occupied northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, derisively known as the Salo Republic. But this was a hollow resurrection. Mussolini was now a shadow of his former self, a weary, defeated old man completely dependent on German military power. He had no real army, no popular support, and no authority. He was a puppet ruler, his strings pulled by Berlin, presiding over the brutal final chapter of Italy's civil war as German forces and die-hard fascists fought a losing battle against the advancing Allies and a burgeoning Italian resistance movement. His fate and the fate of fascism was already sealed.
By late April 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to its bloody conclusion. The Third Reich was collapsing. In Italy, Allied forces were surging through the north, and the Italian resistance, the partigiani, were rising up everywhere, liberating cities and towns from the remnants of fascist and German control. For Benito Mussolini, huddled in Milan, the capital of his crumbling puppet state, the end of days had arrived. He understood that his final desperate gambit was to escape. On April 25th, he attempted to negotiate a surrender with the resistance leaders in Milan, mediated by the city's archbishop. But when he learned they were also negotiating with the Germans behind his back, he flew into a rage. Deeming all deals off, he resolved to make a final run for it. His last hope was to flee to neutral Switzerland. Accompanied by his devoted mistress, Clara Petacci, and a small entourage of his last remaining loyalists, Mussolini left Milan and headed north toward Lake Como and the Swiss border. He initially planned to make a last stand in the mountains, but it was a fantasy. He had no one left to fight for him. The convoy eventually joined a retreating column of German SS soldiers and Italian fascists. To avoid being recognized, Mussolini donned a German corporal's greatcoat and a Luftwaffe helmet, hoping to blend in with the other soldiers. He slumped down in the back of a truck, a pathetic disguise for the man who had once swaggered in magnificent uniforms before adoring crowds. The convoy snaked its way along the western shore of Lake Como, a desperate flight under a gray, foreboding sky. But their luck had run out. On the morning of April 27, 1945, as the convoy passed through the small town of Dongo, it was stopped at a roadblock manned by local partisans from the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. The partisans, commanded by Pierluigi Bellini delle Stelle and Urbano Lazzaro, were on the lookout for high-ranking fascists trying to escape. As they meticulously checked the vehicles, their suspicions were aroused. They began identifying and arresting several fascist ministers traveling in the convoy. Then, in the back of one truck, a partisan noticed a figure slumped on a bench, head down, trying to be invisible. Urbano Lazzaro pulled back the German coat. He saw the heavy jaw, the bald head, the unmistakable face of Benito Mussolini. "Aren't you—" a partisan began. Mussolini looked up, his face pale and weary. There was no fight left in him. He was immediately arrested without a word of protest. He and Clara Petacci, who had been found nearby, were taken to a secluded farmhouse for the night. Within the resistance command, a fierce debate erupted. Should they hand Mussolini over to the Allies, who would undoubtedly put him on trial? Or should they enact their own justice, immediately and decisively? The overwhelming sentiment, especially among the communist partisans who had fought and died to liberate Italy, was for vengeance. For them, Mussolini was the embodiment of 2 decades of tyranny, suffering, and national ruin. He was a war criminal who had sold his country to the Nazis. There would be no trial. There would only be a reckoning. The verdict came swiftly from the clandestine leadership of the resistance in Milano, the Committee of National Liberation for Northern Italy. The order was unequivocal: immediate execution. The man chosen to carry out this historic sentence was a communist partisan leader named Walter Audizio, who operated under the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio. On the morning of April 28, 1945, as the final battles of the war raged across Europe, Audizio and a small detachment of partisans drove to the farmhouse where Mussolini and Clara Petacci were being held. Around 2 p.m. they arrived, informing the prisoners they were there to rescue them. Mussolini and Petacci were hurried into a red Fiat and driven a short distance to the nearby village of Giuliano di Mezzegra. The car stopped in a quiet lane in front of the stone wall of the Villa Belmonte. Mussolini and Petacci were ordered out. The reality of the situation finally dawned on them. Petacci, weeping, threw her arms around Mussolini, refusing to leave his side. At approximately 4:10 p.m., Colonel Valerio raised his submachine gun. According to his own account, he read out a brief sentence of death. As he pulled the trigger, Petacci screamed and leaped in front of her lover, trying to shield him. A burst of bullets cut her down. Another burst struck Mussolini in the chest. They both collapsed to the ground. Even after they were dead, enraged partisans continued to fire into Mussolini's body, riddling it with bullets. The man who had lived by violence died by violence. But the rage of a nation could not be quenched by a few bullets in a quiet village. The story of Mussolini's end was just beginning its most grotesque chapter. The bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and several other executed fascist leaders were thrown onto a truck and driven back to Milano. There was no attempt to hide what had been done. On the contrary, the partisans wanted the world, and especially the people of Milano, to witness the fall of the tyrant. The truck arrived at Piazza Loreto, a large public square. The location was deliberately chosen. A year earlier, fascist militia had publicly executed 15 captured partisans in this very square, leaving their bodies on display as a warning. Now it was time for the final, gruesome act of retribution. The bodies were unceremoniously dumped onto the pavement. As news spread, a vast, roaring crowd converged on the square. It was a scene of primal fury. The people of Milano, brutalized by years of war and oppression, unleashed 2 decades of pent-up hatred. They kicked, spat on, and cursed the lifeless body of their former leader. One woman fired 5 pistol shots into his head, one for each of her sons lost in the war. Others urinated on the corpses. Clara Petacci's body was not spared. It too was beaten and desecrated. Still not satisfied, the mob found ropes and iron meat hooks. They dragged the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and 4 other fascists to the girder of a half-built Standard Oil gas station overlooking the square. They were hoisted up by their feet and left to hang upside down, like animal carcasses in a slaughterhouse, a final horrifying symbol of their utter degradation. The spectacle was so shocking that even Winston Churchill, his sworn enemy, later remarked that the execution was one thing, but the gloating in the awful spectacle was another. After several hours of this public desecration, Allied military authorities and more moderate partisan leaders intervened, ordering the bodies to be cut down. They were taken to a morgue, where Mussolini's battered corpse was laid out for a final grim viewing. He was later buried in an unmarked grave in a Milan cemetery to prevent it from becoming a shrine for neo-fascists. But even in death, Mussolini knew no peace. In 1946, a group of die-hard fascists dug up his body and hid it for months. It was eventually recovered and kept in secret by the state for a decade. Finally, in 1957, the Italian government relented and returned the remains to his family. He was interred in the family crypt in his hometown of Predappio. Today, that tomb remains a site of pilgrimage for neo-fascists and a point of curiosity for historians and tourists. It is the final, quiet resting place for a man whose life of bombastic sound and fury ended not with a bang, but with the horrifying silence of a body swinging from a rope, a brutal and enduring testament to the fate that awaits a tyrant when his people finally rise against him.